Hello, depending on where you are in the world right now, a very good morning, good afternoon, or a good evening, and welcome to Authenticate 2022 Masterclass session on using Fido authentication to defend against account takeover by eliminating passwords and being risk aware. This session is being presented to you all by yours truly, Raj Galagali, and my colleague Balu Santhosh. We both have deep experience in FIDO and identity and access management, and we would love to share what we believe is going to be a useful session in understanding how to leverage FIDO and go from an application that has passwords to completely having your users experience a passwordless solution while taking into consideration all the underlying attributes of risk and trust. I'm going to skip over our bios, and I'm going to start over by sharing our views as to what we believe as the life cycle of a user in a SIAM world. We view that every enterprise has just two types of customers. The first type are those customers that the enterprise is trying to acquire them or bring them on board, or these are the customers that they may or may not have a whole lot of information about. As a result, each enterprise, based upon their internal process, the business requirements, the industry that they're in, they may have different registration and onboarding process. It may include identity verification. It may include different forms of authentication, and so on. The second type of customers in the SIAM world are those customers that the enterprise already knows and they have onboarded them. And they need to provide these customers with access to their application in the best possible manner without compromising on the security. And these customers may navigate within the application for performing variety of services and consuming them. It could be as simple as changing their profile or changing their consent management. If it is a financial application, they may want to go and then conduct some financial transactions. So the entire life cycle of these two types of users within an enterprise journey is where we come in and share our experience as to how you can deliver the best experience without compromising on security. And when I say security, you all are very familiar with authentication, ID verification, multi-factor authentication, or even things like account takeover. And knowing and being aware about the risk and trust of that user throughout this application is really crucial. I would almost say that I'm teaching to the choir here based on the number of surveys that you all are very much familiar that yes, more than 58% of the customers, the Gen Z customers, reuse the same password. The survey from Harris Poll, as per Google, says it's actually 65% of all consumers who reuse the passwords across multiple sites. I think it's an easy takeaway for us to agree that the risk of passwords contribute the maximum when it comes to account takeover, whether it is the financial impact or knowing that it takes less than 40 minutes to crack an 8-character password with numbers, symbols, and letters is a good enough proof point for us to explore how enterprises can eliminate passwords and limit the account takeover. Obviously, the industry is flooded with different techniques, different vectors that are prevalently used when it comes to performing account takeover operations. whether it is credential stuffing, SIM swapping for the mobile devices, bots, phishing, man in the middle, or even using tools to masquerade their IP addresses, their geolocation, use of VPNs, proxy servers. These are all well-known methods. And as a result, every enterprise is trying to put in tools to ensure there aren't as many incidents of account takeover. Yes, many reputed brands have been victims of this, be it Spotify or Meta or the recent Zelle fraud. And fortunately, even the US Office of Management and Budget came out with a memorandum that, hey, there are two ways that every enterprise must adopt as part of zero trust principles. Either you go in with the PIV, which the federal government has been implementing, which is basically identifying yourself with a CAC card or a smart card, or they advised go and then use the World Wide Web Consortium's web authentication standard. And that web authentication standard brings us to the Fido Alliance. To simply put it across, there are 40 board members who all came together from the likes of Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, to the players like Transmit Security and others, and said, we need to come up with a global standard. And as a result, there were two outcomes. One is called the Web Authn, and the second one is the CTAP. Both of them basically deliver on everyone being able to adopt for a given hardware, for a given type of browser, for a given type of application, how they can leverage and come up with a secure, a convenient, a scalable, and that doesn't compromise on the privacy method of authenticating or verifying the identity of that user. So when it comes to security, which is one of the key pillars of Fido 2, it all hinges on the concept of cryptographic keys. Many of you are very familiar with the PKI architecture, or just think about you have something that is very private key and you have a public one, or you can almost think about a lock and a key where that secret never leaves the user's device. Whereas something to verify, which is called as a public key, anyone can have it. And we'll talk about how that is leveraged in the coming slides. But the key of making it really prevalent, making it easier, convenient, is I shouldn't have to go through complex hoops to use it. And how can I use it? All you need is a camera or your fingerprint, your face ID, and a supported device, be it like your iPhone, your tablets, your Android device, your MacBook. All of them support the Fido 2 standard. And as a result, the application developers can now really leverage this through any of the browsers. Whether it is Edge, your Mozilla, your Safari, your Chrome, all the operating system vendors, Microsoft, Google, Android, all Apple, all of them support it, even Red Hat, and all the hardware, which is the mobile device manufacturers, the laptop manufacturers. As a result, the time is right now, wherein you can leverage Fido 2 as an authentication method with the highest form of security to verify the identity without ever having to use passwords. So the standard of Web Authn basically consists of what I'm going to call it as the client side or the end user side, which means they may be using any type of hardware, a laptop, a mobile device, a browser to access an application, and their personal identity as a form of biometric, whether it is their thumb impression, their facial impression, whatever that is. Then on the application side or on the server side, You have an application, but you also need what I'm going to call this as a passwordless and an MFA service, or you will hear the word a Fido server. And this is where those public keys are managed, the identities are managed. And if we can bridge the gap, now you have a solution called Fido authentication or a passwordless authentication. For the technical folks, a little bit about how this works. It's a simple 4-step process. I just now mentioned that it is a combination of what I'm going to call it as a private key that never leaves the device that you're using. And that key is made accessible, or the term is can only be unlocked using that specific user's identity. And then I can tie this to a specific application. Or in other words, what you're seeing over here is, let's say you want to log into, or you want to register first to an application. I'm going to call it as siteabc.com. We have a user Bob. So siteabc.com or that application tells this user, hey, I want you to register for passwordless service. And when the user clicks on it, basically it invokes this web authn process or this protocol, which is the art of generating a new private key that is going to be securely stored on that hardware device, but it is going to be tied to that application, site.com, and to that user, Bob, because it's going to tell Bob, hey, I want you to place your finger or Face ID, and as a result, a private key is generated. It is stored in the hardware, and then the public key is provided to the application. And that is what I meant when I said you need a Fido server or a service that will manage all these user keys and identities. So basically, to summarize, your registration process involves generation of a private key that is tied to an application, tied to a user, and the service provider managing the public key for that specific user for that specific application. Once you have done the registration, you now can go ahead and then anytime that user comes in, you can log in by simply the application giving you a challenge, and you're able to now sign that challenge by that private key that you had just stored on that device that you're able to unlock using your biometric. And once that challenge is signed, now you have the public key that you can verify to make sure that this challenge was indeed signed by user Bob from that particular device, and he was able to use that private key because he was able to successfully identify himself using the biometric method that was used during the registration process. Now, the beauty of this is your secret never left the device. It is simply validating your signing of that message using the biometric that only you can unlock it. And there are no passwords to remember. There is nothing to steal. Now, I want to introduce quickly about passkeys. Until now, I mentioned the concept of a private key. I said it never leaves the device. And I said you would manage the public key. Yeah, maybe I kind of didn't tell you one small thing. You know the three major vendors, Apple, Google, and Microsoft. They're the ones who make all the mobile devices, the operating systems, the browsers, the laptops. Until now, the private key always was stored within that hardware. People call it a secure enclave, a secure element, TPM chips. But the ecosystem of Microsoft, Google, and iCloud said, hey, we want to make it easier for our customers by being able to even sync the private key within my iCloud, within my ecosystem, so that Let's say you get a new iPhone. You don't have to go through that registration process again. As part of your syncing, your apps, your all the passwords, everything, you will also be able to sync that private key that you had generated the first time. So as a matter of convenience, think of passkey in simple terms as credentials that are stored and protected in your iCloud or in your keys, and you can basically restore them across all your devices and reuse them as needed. Thus, the goal of passkey is to really make it easier for consumers to be able to switch devices and reuse the same key once they're generated and stored within your iCloud account, as an example. With that quick background, I just want to share some of what I'm going to call as best practices or guidelines if you want to move into a passwordless journey. Obviously, you can say, yeah, the technology is great. It's simple. I can go and then implement it. While that is very true, we really would like the enterprise to take a step back and see, do I really want to do it myself? If so, ask these hard questions. Do I really understand security very well? Is that my expertise? If the goal is passwordless, Fido is one of the major tools to eliminate passwords. But how do I also address my account takeover problem for non-Fido devices or users coming in incognito mode or across multiple channels, web channel, mobile channel? Can I do something in the call center channel, my chat bots, right? So really being able to look in a holistic manner, or I'll go back to that user journey that I mentioned, the life cycle of a user, that's what you really want to look and ask yourself, do I have the in-house capability to address from the entire end-to-end life cycle of a user, being able to eliminate passwords, being able to leverage Fido, being able to keep up with the evolving standards, and making sure that security is leveraged at all times without compromising on the user experience. Or in other words, you need to be able to go above and beyond WebAuth. What do I mean by that? Three simple things. You want to make sure that your implementation takes into consideration the user experience by being very transparent and frictionless. You want to make sure that you invoke these authentication methods based on context and risk. Or you need to be adaptive and dynamic. Remember, I mentioned about the zero trust principles. What that really means is you want to introduce friction or you want to challenge the user when you have enough information at runtime about the underlying risk and trust. And this is what I meant. When I showed earlier what we view as the life cycle of a user in a SIAM application, this is what we expect the enterprise to be thinking about. A passwordless or an MFA service that is risk-based authentication driven by the context. You are able to leverage the biometric and Fido standards to effectively eliminate passwords. Should there be a scenario where you cannot invoke Fido, maybe because there are older devices, maybe there is no biometric, maybe certain devices or browsers still don't support it, then you need to have other methods that are not password, right? And you need to be able to leverage all the standards such as OIDC, SAML that exist out there when you're building your passwordless and MFA services. And that's why knowing the risk and trust almost as a fabric within your user journey is very crucial for your success. To summarize, I would say, think about a standard-based authentication, have all available methods that you can think, but leading with Fido, leading with biometric wherever possible, and leveraging the next best, strongest factor in certain scenarios. You want to make sure that you can service it across the channel, not just for mobile channel, not just for web channel. How do I leverage that one-time registration of that user and giving them that seamless experience across the channel, across devices? Or you should be able to link the concept of one identity across all the channels. And needless to mention, being able to do it, being risk aware, being able to invoke this only when required so that your customers have the best experience. And when I mentioned zero trust or context or risk aware, this is something that should be happening in the background. Without any user's input, your application must always be able to make a decision based upon all the device attributes that the user is using, the network attributes that the user is coming from, things like bots, things like a man in the middle, session hijacking. Is it the same user who is moving the mouse? Is it the same user who is swiping on that phone? Being able to understand the user's behavior, their profiling. You want to be able to take all of this context without user having to do anything and then make that decision whether I want to perform, say, a step-up authentication. I want to challenge the user with additional methods. And that really plays a key role in driving best customer experience without compromising on the security and the identity of that user. To summarize, I would say these are the 4 pillars every enterprise must always think about. You should be able to eliminate passwords completely by providing smooth customer experience. And when it comes to eliminating passwords, as I mentioned, always lead with Fido, lead with fingerprint. And if it doesn't exist, then think what else can you use? The primary goal should be smooth customer experience. Provide passwordless that works for everyone, right? Doesn't matter what device, where they're coming from, what type of application. In order to support this, you truly need a modern identity architecture, right? You want this to be developer friendly. You want an architecture that can link accounts and eliminate passwords across devices, across channels. And you really want a solution that can scale, right? Make it as a SaaS service or consume it as a SaaS service from whatever vendor that you choose, but make sure that you can scale, you have better visibility, and you're able to accelerate. Yes, probably you want to go and then attend another session in this conference here. One of the largest customers is rolling out passwordless to 200 million banking clients across 160 countries. Maybe you'll get some insights as to how they were able to do this and then get to know that, hey, you could be next who is going to take on this project of rolling out passwordless solution to your customers. For the technologies that are out there, I would simply say you need a platform, because I mentioned about Fido. I mentioned about underlying risk. I mentioned about being a very developer-friendly solution. I mentioned about making it scalable, being able to consume on demand. Or I would say if you're going to build it, great. Or if you're looking for someone to help you build it, I would say think of an architecture like this, where you want to make sure that you can integrate it using APIs. You can consume it through cloud. You can consume it as an individual services, right? You may not be ready to do everything on day one. You may want to do just web authent to begin with. Later on, you want to think about other services as a fallback method or the next available stronger methods that you want to implement. Then you want to see how you can leverage risk. So really, you need a SIAM platform that will provide you with flexibility, the modularity, and the developer-friendly APIs or SDK as a way for you to be successful. So with that quick background, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Balu, who is actually going to show you how you can go from a username password-based application that uses authentication to go completely passwordless using WebAuthn that we spoke about. So he's really going to show you all about registration, all about authentication, the whole thing that we discussed. He's going to show it in action. Over to you, Balu.
Thanks, Raj, for setting the stage. What I would like to do in the next 15 minutes is to show how to take a very simple web application that has username password authentication and enable it for passwordless authentication. Before we dive into the demo application or look at any code, I will use few slides that describe the data flow for the current application, as well as the passwordless registration and authentication flows. This slide shows the existing application setup. The application is intentionally very simple. The front end is built using HTML and JavaScript, and backend is Node.js. The user navigates to the application, gets a login page, enters credentials, and clicks submit. The backend validates the credentials and presents the home page if the credentials are valid. For the demo purposes, the credentials are hard-coded into the backend code. Next, let's look at the registration flow. As part of the registration flow, the user would log into the application using existing credentials. Again, for demo purpose, we are showing it as username and password. But ideally, we should authenticate the user using the highest assurance authentication modality available before allowing the registration for passwordless. We all know that there is no value in enabling a strong authenticator by relying on a weak user identification. Once the user is logged in, the user would click on Register for Passwordless button. This invokes a risk assessment service to determine if there are any high risk or fraud indicators associated with this particular interaction, like credential stuffing, bot activity, or session hijacking, to name a few. If everything checks out and we get a green light, we proceed with the registration. User is presented with the registration screen. Once the user completes authentication, the service redirects the user back to the application with an authorization code. The application exchanges that code for an ID token, validates ID token, and extracts the user identifier from it. The identifier is then stored on the profile of the currently logged in user. This ensures that when a user authenticates using passwordless, we'll be able to identify the local user profile associated with that passwordless user. The authentication flow is very similar. The user clicks on login with passwordless option. User is presented with the authentication screen. Once the user completes authentication, the service redirects the user back to the application with an authorization code. The application exchanges that code for an ID token, validates ID token, and extracts the user identifier from it. The user identifier is used to find the local user profile, and the user is logged in. So let's dive into the actual demo and the application code. So this is a simple demo application. It has an username and password based login. So let's try logging in. I'm now logged in and I get the homepage of the application. Let's look at the actual application code. This is HTML for the application. It's very simple. It has a username, password field, and the submit button. And when the submit button is clicked, the application invokes a login route on the backend, passing in the username and password. And if it gets an OK message back, it takes the user to a home page, else it will display the error to the user. Let's look at the backend application code. Here you can see there is only one route, which is a login route. And all it does is it checks the incoming username and password with a hard-coded value. And if it matches, replies with OK, else replies with failed. Now let's make this application passwordless. I have the code already written for making this application passwordless. I will copy paste that code into the corresponding HTML and JS files, and then we will go through each step of it. So let's copy the HTML file first. Here you can see that we are doing a few different things. First of all, we are loading the passwordless SDK. Then we are initializing it. For initializing it, we need a client ID because this leverages an OIDC based authentication. What we'll do is we'll go into the passwordless console and create a client ID and client secret for us to use. After the initialization, there is the invoke function, which is invoked by the front end when a user tries to log in or register for passwordless. We also have a risk assessment function as part of the register passwordless flow. When the user clicks register for passwordless, it invokes the risk assessment first. And depending on the response from the risk assessment, the user is allowed to proceed with passwordless registration or not. Now let's look at the backend code. I'll copy paste the code for the passwordless into the index.js, and then we'll go through it. The backend needs the client ID and client secret from the passwordless service. It has the same login route that we had earlier to allow authentication using username and password. It also has the register for passwordless route, login passwordless route, and the get risk details route. It has a client ID and client secret that you will get from the passwordless service. It has the same login route as before, which is used for the username password authentication. It also has the new routes, register passwordless, which is triggered when the user tries to register for passwordless authentication. Login passwordless route will handle the login request for passwordless authentication. And the get risk details is called by the application front end to perform risk evaluation before allowing passwordless registration. Here you can see that the client ID and client secret required for the risk analysis is already populated because I had fetched this from the console and already coded it in here. But for the passwordless authentication itself, we'll go into the console, create a new application, create client ID and client secret, and come back and plug it into this application. So let's go into the console and create that application. I'm logging in as a user balu.santhosh plus authenticate 2022. Presenting my biometrics on Mac, and I am logged in. The application tab, creating a new application. I'll call it Authenticate 2022. Provide a logo for it. Keep the client name same. My client ID and client secret is generated. To complete the configuration, all I need is a redirect URI for my application. So I'll copy that redirect URIs and paste it here. Now I'll copy the client ID into my application first. It's needed in two places. Once in the HTML file for the SDK initialization. And it also is needed in the backend Node.js file. I'll now copy the client secret into the Node.js file. Okay, that's the only change required in this now. Let's restart the application and test the flow. Restart the application now. Let's go refresh this page. And now you can see that the new HTML that we added has taken effect. There is a passwordless login as well as login another way. I have not registered for passwordless, so I'm going to log in using my existing credentials. And here is my register for passwordless button. When I hit this button, it's going to invoke the risk service first. And based on the recommendation from the risk service, it's going to decide whether to allow me to proceed or not. And in this case, you can see that the risk service came back with a challenge response. So the application is not going to allow me to proceed. And that is because I have been playing around with this particular browser and changing the user agent and clearing cache and cookies, etc. So the risk analysis came back with a challenge response. For the demo purpose, what we'll do is we'll go back into the code and comment off the portion that does the risk analysis. For demo purposes, I have done this risk analysis check on the front end in a real application. This check should be done on the back end so that the end user have no ability to bypass these kind of controls. And let's refresh the application again. And log in again. And click on register for passwordless. So you can see that it has redirected me to the passwordless service page. I click continue, present my biometrics. And the passwordless service now has given the code back to the application. Application has exchanged that for an ID token and validated it. And it shows me a message saying that you have successfully registered for passwordless login. And I'm back in the dashboard. So if I log out now, I should be able to log in using passwordless option. Takes me to the passwordless service. I present my biometrics. And I'm in. So let's go back and look at some additional aspects of the passwordless solution. Now we have seen how to enable application for passwordless. Let's talk about how to drive user adoption. What you have seen is that introducing passwordless enrollment into flows like password reset and forgot usernames are very effective. Those users are currently feeling the pain of legacy authentication, so they are more likely to adopt passwordless. Another excellent point to introduce passwordless is during account registration or new account opening, giving the users the ability to go passwordless from the start and driving passwordless as the primary authentication modality. Incentivizing users to use passwordless helps as well. This could be discounts or coupons for retail scenarios, or lower challenge or post-login introductions for banking use cases. Last but not least, constantly educate users on benefits of passwordless and help them to keep their account safe. So what do you need to look for in a passwordless service? The authentication itself based on standards like OIDC and strong identification using standards like Fido and WebAuthn are table stakes. But to make this passwordless service supportable, you need at least the following capabilities. You should be able to integrate your different applications into the same passwordless service. It should have a view of all your users. It should have elements of risk and trust, which will allow you to contextualize the passwordless authentication. You should be able to see the various user activity logs and audit logs. You should be able to brand the passwordless service to meet the branding requirements of your various applications. And of course, to meet your global users, you need multilingual support. And from an end user controls perspective, the user should be able to manage their own profile, manage their devices, see all their devices, as well as see all the activities they have performed. This is very important because otherwise these users will have to depend on your support services and call centers for these kind of end user activities. While we showed the use case of taking a web application passwordless, the same can be applied to all channels, whether it's mobile, call center, in-store, branch, or even chatbots. The beauty is that once a user is registered to the passwordless solution, the same registration can be leveraged to authenticate the user in any of the other channels. I really hope that this session and demo was useful to all of you, and you will be able to embark on a passwordless journey. Thank you. Back to you, Raj.
Thank you, Balu. I think that was a wonderful way of you being able to demonstrate, even to our developers, how easy and what they need to do in order to integrate WebAuthn into their application, leverage the underlying risk signals, and then make the right decision so as not to compromise on the security while still being able to deliver the best customer experience. I'm simply going to close it out by sharing with you all that as developers, you really want to think from an end-to-end user journey within your application. Always lean on using standards, whether it is OIDC, whether it is WebAuthn, whether it is certain types of APIs. That will make your life much easier. Always think of the user and their journey in terms of, hey, today I may have one iPhone, tomorrow there is a new iPhone, I'm going to bring it on. How do I ensure that I'm able to link that user without having that user to go through yet another registration process? Right? And finally, I would say, you authenticate the person, not the password. The subtle message in that is you can build truly a passwordless service if you are able to really understand the user's behavior, the user's journey within your application that is being delivered through multiple channels, your web channel, your mobile channel, your chatbots, your call center. How do you ensure that you're able to identify the person using methods such as biometric? You're able to minimize the fraud. You're able to understand the account takeover vectors in real time and are able to drive a very secure and smooth experience for your customers. Or you're able to identify unique identities and then make decisions. Thank you. Thank you for attending this session. As always, if there are any questions, please reach out to us and we'll be very happy to share our experience and see how we can help you. Thank you.